We are live. All right.
Right.
Hello. Welcome to Hangops. It is March 25th, 2016. It's been a minute since the last one, but pretty excited today. We're going to talk about orchestration and the cloud and the good, the bad, and the scripted. Got a couple awesome folks here to talk about it. So do some quick intros. I'll start with you, Charity.
Charity Majors, Mipsy Tipsy on Twitter. I just came off a few years at Facebook and Parse, and I'm now building something completely new to try and make machine data better for engineers. And I've been doing a lot of terraforming.
And
I'll go
you,
with
Kevin.
that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I had to
I work at a place called Bano, and we've been working on an infrastructure project for a while now that includes Terraform and Docker, Mesos. And I hope to talk today about sort of how we flow all of that up to production, the whole idea behind it. So,
Cool.
willing to help with anything.
Yeah, of course. I'm Brandon, and my background with this stuff is I got started in Terraform pretty early while I was at Lookout Mobile Security. We dove in even to the module system pretty early there. I was able to even help kickstart some module things on GitHub and things, and trying to do a very modular approach to AWS. Uh, even before the days of like split and join, and so that was kind of interesting. And because there was a lot of complex systems there, different applications, lots of different backends, and so got a lot of interesting start there. But then last year I switched to Travis, and we do use Terraform, but our usage is much more like straightforward. It's like a couple of small services, fairly flat network. So it's uh, what we have is almost not complex enough to where we don't do a ton of module-based work. So I've actually kind of fallen away from doing a lot of that. But we are doing multi-cloud. We're using AWS, GCE, and a little bit of Heroku, so that's kind of interesting. And but given that, I'm excited to have you, Charity, and you, Kevin, talk because I think you're doing a lot more complex orchestration usage with this stuff than I am right now. And so, yeah.
For myself personally, I am doing a shitload of really complex Terraform stuff, and my next goal is to do less. I think that in this day and age, if you are fortunate to be spinning up an infrastructure from scratch, you have no excuse not to be starting with either Terraform or CloudFormation or one of the wrappers, right? Like Sparkle Formation or what is it, Troposphere, one of those things. Like versioned infrastructure is the future. It is really, really, really challenging to go from a non-versioned infrastructure, did shit in the console, right? And then just tried to backport it, and like we did this shit at Parse, right? We would make changes in the console or via the API, and then we would, diff the output and then check that into Git, and holy fuck does that suck a lot, right? So if you have the luxury of starting from scratch, like orchestration is what we should be doing. But I also feel equally strongly that you should be doing as little as possible with your orchestration layer and have a super clear vision for, all right, which things should Packer be doing? Which things should my AMI be doing? Which things should my orchestration tier be doing? And keeping in mind that it has the largest potential for damage, right? And then what things can I delegate to my config management layer, where the blast radius is usually not your entire environment or your entire infrastructure, but one host or one set of hosts. Kevin, how do you feel?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with the phrase versioned infrastructure. And there was this time when I sort of realized, and we talked about internally, that staging UAT and production are just different git SHAs of our skeleton environment, and different version sets worth of the deployables that make it in there, worth of the tested infrastructure that we've put through Jenkins, and that flow of staging UAT in production is really important when it comes to infrastructure as code and making sure that everything passes the tests. Everything that you can do with automation is very dangerous. You can delete your entire infrastructure with Terraform. What we've done is to institutionalize a tool that we call InfraTool, which sort of wraps which sort of wraps the way that we use Packer and Terraform and institutionalizes the way that those things interact with Mesos and Docker. So the Terraform destroy isn't used in UAT staging and production. We always sort of roll forward to the next version set, which is sort of one way we get around sort of the most dangerous parts of Terraform, in my opinion. So if there's any other things you want me to talk through, I certainly will.
Yeah, completely. So the stage that I'm at with Terraform, let me tell you a scary little bedtime story. As of last week, I had fucking everything working in Terraform for like, just like, you know, everything. And it was complicated, and like everything from VPCs to like access layers, all this shit. And I'm like, well, you know, this is a staging environment so far. I'm just gonna like add multi-AZ RDS or Aurora so that I can have like a copy of this as production. And we already had staging and production working very well. I could pick up one or the other. Turns out, huge bugs in both. Like, it poisoned my entire state file. I was like doing manual surgery on the state file. And as a result of a change that I was trying to make to my staging environment, like if we were live, this would have been the worst production outage of my life. Like all of my environments would have been down for 16 hours. I had to like I couldn't even use Terraform to destroy everything. I had to go to the console, go to like, you know, 20, 30 different screens, select all, delete. It was really scary. And this is the point where I think I reached out to you and I'm like, so separate state files. This feels pretty non-negotiable to me. And I also, like, this feels like the right pattern. Like, what I really want to be able to do is not only have modules, because like we've fully modularized everything, but I also want to be able to modularize the environments and have each of one of them have a state file, which is something that you can't really do without a wrapper script. I'm finding out that everyone who reaches a certain level of maturity with Terraform has a wrapper script of some sort, right? Because you want to be able to work off a branch, say, in Git, make a change to your module, test it in staging, and then like promote that clean set of changes to your master environment. And I'm like 50% of the way through like that change, so I'm really curious in hearing about what your actual wrapper script does and where your state files are stored and how you manage that.
So I'll be particularly clear in saying that this is also just sort of under development, right? So, but there is a vision for how this is moving forward, and I believe that we've made a pretty good strides in this flow to production. Every time we build a new module, every time we add something to the infrastructure, we make sure that it passes a PR test in Jenkins before we merge it into master. And the outage that you talked about is like the worst case scenario, but I wish I could say that I haven't had those scenarios with Terraform before where like you can't delete the infrastructure because the state file's messed up, right? So we actually have, for that instance, is we tag everything that gets created by Terraform with a special tag so that we have a special delete everything, if necessary, command, so that everything's, so that we don't delete things that aren't tagged that way.
Oh God, that's really smart. I'm making a note of that.
That's Luke Amdor, another architect on my team. One thing that you mentioned about your outage is the separate state files, and I can speak to that. But before I speak to that, I think that what's really important is that your infrastructure gets tested and hardened before it makes it to master. Then master then becomes the SHA that is the state file for staging. And then that promotion from staging to UAT is meant to be a practice run for deploying to production. So that if you mess up the promotion from staging to UAT, then it's you've learned a lesson A, that you missed something in dev, and B, you didn't mess up production itself. So
Sorry,
really
what's UAT?
User acceptance testing. Yeah. So some people call it pre-prod. Some people say dev, staging, production, right? In my opinion, it's just 3 environments where things make it to staging, you have to make sure that everything works well together. Things make it to UAT where QA occurs, and effectively it becomes a practice run for then deploying to production. So I've had in the past with Chef big Hadoop outages because we didn't practice the changes we were going to make on UAT before we touched production. So the one thing I highlighted earlier about the Git SHAs is that you can think of the Terraform code as infrastructure as SHA after SHA after SHA after SHA of commits, right? So production's always going to be behind UAT. UAT is always going to be behind staging. Staging is always going to be reasonably close to master. And the idea is that in Jenkins, what we do is we fire up the entirety of the infrastructure for a PR build, and then make sure that it passes all the tests that we've written, the sanity tests. One thing that we'd like to also do is take the staging state and then apply our changes in the Jenkins run. Because that's really what's occurring with Terraform, is you do a plan and apply, a plan and apply, a plan and apply. So that the Jenkins run before it makes it to master should really also follow that pattern itself. So there's all these, effectively, these guardrails and this whole sort of funnel up to production wherein you hope to mess things up really early. And so that you can sort of work on your own sort of version of production or staging or UAT or dev or master or whatever you want to call it in isolation, where you hammer on working everything out. That's a local state file that you blow out everything. And then there's just a state file for staging, UAT, and prod. All of that's just version sets, and SHAs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How specifically do you manage your state files? Because I started out just local, because it's just me, right? It's just me working on this. Local state files were fine. I switched to S3 recently, and last night I was at work until way too late, basically just trying to figure out how to have a different state file for each. And it's like, do I treat this as a module? Like, directory structures matter so much. I wish I could just like say, apply apply Terraform, but starting with this top level file, and have all of the inheritances and stuff work correctly, and then just write a wrapper around that, kind of like what you were saying, that would specify the name of the state file, output to store in S3. Do you guys use S3 or Atlas or what?
We started, of course, like I think everyone starts out, with local state files that get committed to GitHub. Now the question is whether or not there are any secrets in that. So if there are any secrets in your Terraform config, then they must not make it to GitHub, right? That's just one.
Anywhere, really.
That's one caveat. So right now we still use local state files, but the idea, of course, is to make sure that whatever is right for your environment. If you need to back up to S3, you back up to S3. If you back up to Atlas, you back up to Atlas. But two people shouldn't be changing the state file at the same time, which is why we have developers working on their own copy of production, and then Jenkins changes one thing, Jenkins changes the next thing, Jenkins changes the next thing. So there's just single change. Of course, then an operator flips to production. I'm talking about things that are in
Right.
development, right? Not all the kinks are worked out, but that's what I believe is sort of the correct way to work with this infrastructure when you view it this via this lens. Um, I talked about a couple of things there. Did I actually answer your question?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I think that one of the things about Terraform right now is that anyone who's trying to do anything remotely sophisticated is going to be blazing their own path. I mean, Brandon, your modules for me, when like my first week of like looking at Terraform and trying to use it, I'm like, oh shit, yeah, there are already community modules. I can start from these. And what I realized really quickly was, uh, no, they're only like a year old and they're already mostly useless to me. and and it reminds me a lot of when I started using Chef, which was like, 4 or 5 years ago. And at first I was like, oh yay, community cookbooks. This will give me a head start. And then pretty quickly realized, no, like the ecosystem just isn't mature enough. And if you're committing to relying on a tool in production that is this early, you are committing to uh, writing a lot of shit yourself, finding out a lot of best practices for your own environment because um, because they don't exist, right? Reusable solutions between environments don't really exist. I mean, I've gotten a lot of um, wisdom and suggestions from like listening to you talk about your infrastructure, Kevin. But like if you were to give me your wrapper script, it would not be usable for me, right?
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. Like I'm actually, I'm kind of excited about being in a position for once um, to be able to have a slightly higher risk tolerance. Like our startup is so early, don't have customers, that I feel like I have the chance to kind of help the technology grow up. Whereas usually I'm one of those people who's like, I have a tolerance for, 99.98, which means I'm not I'm not using anything more cutting edge than auto scaling groups, right? So that was like a long-winded answer to the answer of whether or not you answered my question, which is not really, but as well as I think you possibly can.
You reminded me of a couple of things that I did want to highlight, which was we have a skeleton environment which is in one repo. The Terraform modules live in there. One folder is called skeleton that then references the modules. Um, that that skeleton is then copied into another Git repo called environments, where it's pulled down to a staging folder, it's pulled down to a UAT folder, it's pulled down to a prod folder. And there's a tool in that repo that handles making sure that the right clone occurs for the right SHA.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. We also have a
Oh, that is actually super helpful.
Mhm.
That sounds
necessary.
that sounds simpler than what I was like messing with.
Um, and to speak to what you said about like open source modules and things like that, is that I hit this point with open source chef cookbooks where I realized that I can't take the free route, which is that when I need to scale up or scale out something, I need to understand, for example, how MongoDB actually functions, as opposed to the fact that
Yeah.
I picked up a cookbook that set it up once, right? So I'm of the opinion at this point that you need to understand and understand well the foundation that you sort of your infrastructure rides atop. Um,
I
so
completely agree, but I would say that that's with the caveat of there are a limited number of things you can, and you should limit the number of things that you have to understand that deeply.
uh,
There are so many nuts and bolts to running a very sophisticated production infrastructure that like nobody should have to be an HA proxy expert. Like once every 2 years you may have to have an HA proxy problem that you have to dig into. Like yes, and whoever's I don't know who you are saying like the wrappers. I think that like for the nuts and bolts and the super basic shit, like um, it is so nice that the community cookbooks have gotten to a place now where you can be like, all right, here's like my cron's a bad example, but like here are like 20 things that I just need to set up. and I don't need to like intensely understand and scale. Where
It's slow.
databases, almost never going to be that one of those. Yeah.
So a couple of the things that I ran into, and I think this is part of why maybe some of the community stuff hasn't gotten off the ground as much as it could have, was really it kind of boiled down to the lack of the ability to, one, do like intermodule dependencies for like the, as part of like the this comes before that stuff. Like you couldn't refer to something like deep in a dependency, and there were a lot of cases for that. And then the other one was just like a lack of ability to pass around complex data between modules, and like, split and join came along shortly before I kind of like moved out of where I was spending any time working on stuff that was using modules. And I know
And
that helped
split
a
and
little bit.
join suck.
And I know that I believe that like array support is coming. I think like some of
Maps
the
are coming.
HCL, I think some stuff
Yeah.
in HCL just got merged. It'll make that happen. But I think it's stuff like that that also is like, it really kind of limits how much reusability you can make in a module. Like even all the stuff we were doing, a lot of it was based around the idea that everything was going to go in an auto-scaling group. And if you were doing like, like it's a single server, you would just set your, like, basically you'd just say like this ASG should never do anything. But the ASG was still kind of the wrapper for like how instances were created in every case, because it gave you like a single like, layer to decide what made EC2 instances become a thing. And that doesn't
So
necessarily work.
I think that that's actually a really, really good pattern, and I appreciate that Terraform makes it hard to do anything other than that. Personally, I would so much rather delegate the managing and the scaling of my instances to auto-scaling groups and deal with things like just have a first boot script, that does things like, setting your host name and your environment and like downloading your code and all this shit. When I was talking about Terraform being an absolutely critical player, but being very conscious about the scope that you limit it to, I think one of the ways to make Terraform less dangerous is to make it not responsible for instances, only responsible for scoping out services like ASGs.
If you're lucky enough to be in an environment where you can use ASGs, right? I have to support
Correct.
instances as the lowest common denominator. So, but I do agree with you, for example, that everything that you do with Terraform should sort of fit that declarative model. I declare that I want an instance. I declare that I want a auto-scaling group. So, for example, what we do with Mesos is that Zookeeper comes up, Mesos masters and Mesos slaves. And then Marathon is the init for the rest of the containers, so that we declare to Marathon, we want these containers to run. And I let Marathon and Mesos sort of handle the higher level orchestration that Terraform honestly shouldn't do. All I'm doing is stating that I declare that this container needs to be run somewhere in the infrastructure by this infrastructure tool, this orchestrator tool.
Totally. What and I like the ASG model as well, but even as like we were sort of figuring out that model for stuff that we were migrating from a data center into AWS at Lookout, and a lot of what myself and Charity, Brandon Leach, who's still at Lookout, I believe you're all pals. They're still using a lot of what he and I kind of and other people on a team were like sort of like crafting, at the beginning of last year, and but even with folks that were, other ops and engineering folks that were familiar with AWS and things, like the initial reaction to an ASG is like, well, isn't that for like short-lived stuff? Like it's a little bit of like you have to bend your mind a little bit and sort of almost like play with it with like basically that mode of like just do nothing, like it's just going to bring up that instance, the instance is going to get chefed or whatever into its role, and then it's just going to sit there. Because like if it dies, right, a new one can come up, and then you can do some things around that. But just the idea of like everything ASG, but like most of this stuff I don't want to come and go. Like you sort of have to adapt your mind to it. And As far as wrappers,
By adapt your mind to it, you mean drum that out of people.
yeah. You have to you look at all the things it brings you, and then you can fit it into your mental model of the infrastructure, and it does work well. Um, Even for things that are more stateful, you just put some guards around things, and your scaling policies do nothing by default.
I think that it's an amazing pattern. Like Art Crowley from Slack, he has a policy of no instance, even database instances, is allowed to live for more than like 60 or 90 days. There's like a random kill script that just like terminates them, and I love that. Like I plan on doing that too. I mean, that's the way to make sure that anything in your system can die at any minute, and like the pipeline is clean.
Does that include things like RDS instances or ELBs or any of the more like
Uh,
service managed stuff?
I think ELBs no. They don't use RDS. Like they're a MySQL hands-on shop. ELBs are different. That seems like a terrible idea.
Yeah. Just curious how far they went. Because more and more, right? Like one of the niceties, especially being in AWS, is the sort of like third and fourth level abstracted things like Aurora and Redshift and Kinesis, right? And then you even get up into like stuff like Lambda, right? Super, super abstracted. It's interesting, like how much do you like?
Yes and no. Like every variation on ELB that they've ever done, I think is amazing, and I'm including like the new the NAT, the intra AWS NAT service that is basically like ELB for network address translation. Awesome. I don't, since I don't trust AWS with my data, I don't really trust AWS with my databases. Everything that they do for databases is so slow, like incredibly slow, and I have no visibility into what's happening, and sometimes it fails. And there are lots of arbitrary limits, things like Kinesis, which I understand why they implemented them because they have co-tenancy problems, like fuck all. But I don't want to play with those limits, and I'm comfortable running those things myself. So yeah, I really love all the extra layers of abstractions they're using, but I find that they're most applicable to me at the networking level and not at the stateful level.
I have opinions about stateful services when it comes to using Terraform, because what you talked about with, I mean, it would be great, in my opinion, if I could use a third-party service for my database that I trusted, that was performant, that wouldn't lose my data, and wouldn't be a problem, right? Somebody else handle like the availability and the scalability of the database tier. I think the reality is, in my opinion, that AWS isn't there yet, or there are lots of shops that don't have the ability to leverage that. So that if you have to set up your own databases and you want to adopt the model of instances can't hang around for more than 90 days, 60 days, 30 days, whatever, you get this problem where you need to roll out new instances all the time. So the stateful ones fall into three sort of camps. There's the ones like Postgres that are master-slave. There's the replicated by default ones, excuse me, like Cassandra and Hadoop. And then there's sort of the other ones that are just sort of like, files on a box that need to be sort of replicated on their own. They're sort of special snowflakes. I think that for most of these things, that the notion of killing an instance and then saying, is my state okay, is everything replicated, before I kill the next instance, is my state okay, is everything replicated, kill the next instance, is my state okay, is everything replicated, is really the key of terraforming stateful services, so that you can prove through tests, through Jenkins, through whatever, that your databases are resilient to individual node failure. And that's sort of this middle ground between using sort of the nice things like that AWS provides, and sort of treating your stateful services as nodes that you have to be more careful about, and perhaps treat like mutable as opposed to immutable. Anyway, that's sort of a monologue stump speech about it.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I 100% agree. And there are some databases where this is way easier to do. There's more tooling than others, that will just come up. They it's all about the last couple of years for me have been all about learning the power of first boot scripts, especially in conjunction with like tags. You know, if an instance comes up and it's like, I'm coming up for the first time, what are my tags? What is my role? What ASG am I in? Am I supposed to have data? Oh, I don't have data. Where am I supposed to get that data from? Who's my master? Who am I supposed to catch up to? Like, all this shit is so doable in first boot scripts. And I agree with you, Kevin. I'm not to the point yet where I'm doing all this with Jenkins, but that's definitely the goal that we have to achieve. Like databases shouldn't be special.
It's pie in the sky, in my opinion. It's not all finished at our shop either, but that's my goal. And furthermore, I like what you said about sort of first boot scripts. And I used to do a lot of stuff with Chef, where like I would have this this base box cookbook, right? And every time I ran the Chef run, it would take 2 minutes to go through it, like, is everything set up for the base box, right? These days, I put everything in Packer. I pull up my instances in parallel, because that's what takes a while, and then I mutate them individually so that each tier comes up like in the correct order. So Terraform does like basically that tagging you were talking about of now I'm mutating you into this speciality, and everything was kind of baked into the instance to begin with.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So you're using Terraform as a coordinator for ordering.
Ordering. So in my opinion, Terraform's sort of shining, I don't know what the right way to put it is, its best feature is that I can say, this is my tier. This is something that tests that it's available before I make my next tier. This is something that tests that it's available before I make my next tier. All the way up to the load balancer and then to the DNS. So that in a disaster recovery scenario, as long as I have warm databases in my containers and my images in another data center, what I can do is go build up the entire structure of the infrastructure, and then sort of switch the DNS. So that's sort of the underlying goal, in my opinion, of defining your infrastructure as a whole in Terraform, since it's a dependency solver, and is the best reason for it being declarative instead of imperative, right? So I don't have to infer the dependency ordering myself. I just state that this depends upon this implicitly if I use its IP or something like that, and Terraform figures out this ordering. But what's really important is that when you have a tier that comes up, is that you verify that it's ready before you do the next one. You can do that with a null resource and a little script that just spins until Zookeeper's ready, or the Mesos masters are up and alive, or something like that.
So
Yeah, that's a super interesting model. Sorry. Someone else. Go ahead, Brandon.
there's two sort of topics I want to make sure we touch. I'm just going to put them out there and then we can get to them. But the first one is like the collaborative angle, on state files, especially like if you're not using Atlas's remote state storage, because I know Atlas, has some of the collaboration stuff built into it. So like, if anyone's doing do-it-yourself, or at least thoughts on that. And then the other one is, oh gosh, I'll try to remember it. But I think that's the big one. That's a question a lot of folks have, is like, how do we do like state form collaboration and change collaboration?
I'll take a stab at it. My opinion is that one actor should be changing the state file when it's important for your environments, and that coordination can happen at a human level. Now, if somebody were to corrupt your state file wherein two people were making a change before it was checked in, you would have a merge conflict, right? I think that's one problem with the local state file model that Atlas attempts to solve, which is that you have locking, so you check out just like Subversion or something like that, where you check out the code base, you make your changes, and they come back in. We've taken the approach that that's a human model sort of thing, is that one person is sort of the leader for making these changes to each environment. And we haven't had problems with it. It's a policy thing as opposed to a automation thing.
What's the rationale
Yep.
for not storing the state in the tags inside of AWS itself. I don't know enough about Terraform to know if there's actually a specific purpose that they felt that that was an acceptable solution for, or rationale of why that wasn't an acceptable solution. I've written a separate tool for my organization that we use, and we just store all the state inside the tags so that there's no state file that needs to be maintained separately. So I'm curious why that is.
I have opinions about that. One is that not everyone has the luxury of using AWS, and that Terraform itself is useful because you hit it sort of declaratively states that you can work with every API. So, for example, if you use Cloudflare, and you want to set up Cloudflare to point something to it, but that's separate service from AWS, right? So it has this notion of a local state file that represents all of the APIs that you may interact with. One thing that I saw the other day that I thought was an interesting use of Terraform is to manage your GitHub permissions and repositories and things like that, because that's merely an API that you can have a declarative model atop. So the model that you've adopted, in my opinion, to be clear, I think is a good model when you're only on AWS, right? Because you don't have to have a separate state-like service, right? You can rely on AWS to sort of keep that and sort of make it so it's not complex. But there's the notion.
Yeah, it does make me a little. Yeah, I totally agree. But so I'm like, okay, so you're storing all the state file information in your AWS tags. Holy fuck, I can think of some really scary disaster scenarios that you could get yourself into there. There's just a lot of points for failure. But it's interesting. I would be super interested in like seeing how that actually works and like seeing what your actual problems are.
It's
To kind
an
of circle
open
back to
source.
Brandon's.
It's an open source project on our organization's GitHub account, Zinx Health. It's called ZOZ, Zinx AWS Automation Tool. You can take a look at it. It's only supports EC2 for the most part. It doesn't have the wide array of services that AWS has, and so yes, there's probably many ways in which it's going to be limited. But it doesn't just use tags. In some of the resources, you don't have to use tags because you can uniquely identify things by a combination of VPC ID and subnet and certain. So it's intelligent about figuring out where it needs to use tags and where it doesn't have to, and then it's idempotent. So it has a lot of the things that we value in making automation built in, and so it's worked fairly well. We haven't run into too many single points of failure. You can take a look at it if you like, but I'm not promoting the continuation of it as a open source project. I'm actually looking at the other things out there like Terraform and Chef Provisioner because of trying to adopt some of the tooling that is currently being utilized more widespread. But
As
regardless,
someone who's used Chef Provisioner and really, 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 really wanted it to work, it doesn't. Like, your options are really Terraform or a CloudFormation wrapper.
yeah.
I did want to like answer Brandon's question though about collaboration. I've been really fortunate so far because it's just me, so I can do whatever the fuck I want. We did just start letting a couple of our other engineers. By I mean strongly encourage making other people make changes, and we found that the generating a state file and then applying that state file is very important for giving people confidence. And eventually, I think that checking into Git and then having Git be the one that makes the changes is the right pattern there. It just really doesn't support multiple people committing and making changes. But also, I think that like we're in the very early chaos-driven stages of our startup, right? Where changes are being made all the time, and it's like a personal goal of mine with Terraform to make Terraform something that changes very, very, very rarely because it's so fucking delicate. I want things that are changing often, things that deal with configuration changes, things that deal with, DNS, things that deal with, like, I want to push as much intelligence out to either the Packer build side or the first boot and the chef configuration side, because the blast radius for destruction is so much lower there.
I take a slightly different stance, but I completely agree with sort of why you've gone down that road. The only reason I take that stance is that we've invested a significant amount of time in making sure that all of the changes that plan and apply that occur in Terraform are tested and tested and tested and tested, such that I agree with you that Terraform is particularly delicate, which is why there is such a heavy focus on Jenkins running the PR builds and testing each individual module worth of infrastructure. So we do the DNS, we do the declaring that containers are like running on top Mesos, but only because I feel like I'm building with bricks, because I have the tests. That's the only difference, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. Brandon, was there something else you wanted to talk about?
Oh yeah, the other thing is I just wanted to mention in the terms of wrapper stuff. We are doing a few things with just make files in terms of like providing like some shortcuts for things. So that's kind of one of the things we're doing right now.
Just to make sure I understand the question, you just kind of want to understand the way in which the wrappers work in sort of in our environments. Is that?
You're talking to me now? I was more asking, I'm like sort of following Charity on Twitter and hearing she's like, oh, worst outage of my life, that sort of thing. Why? The thing that I guess I'm confused about is why do you want to use something that sort of describes your whole infrastructure in one shot versus having automation around building up pieces or sort of like iteratively working towards the end goal as opposed to sort of doing it all in one go?
In my opinion, it's because it solves the DR problem, right? I don't have to have a warm environment elsewhere. Like I said earlier, is that if I can Terraform apply in another data center and everything that comes up, that's great. But honestly, like the same idea applies with a series of well-tested scripts that build up each tier in the correct order, right? I just depend upon the dependency chain. But also to speak to your other point about like what's fragile about Terraform is that it's young, and that not all of the resources are well tested by the community. So especially early on, I had scenarios where, well, the state file's in a state where it what am I going to do? Do I have to roll it back and clean up the resources that it made? Do I blow out everything and try again? So those are just bugs, right? And I believe that's what Charity ran into with the resources she was attempting to use, because they
with RDS. Yeah, with RDS and Aura. So I'll tell you why from my perspective. I believe this is the future. Like I believe that there's so much community demand, and we want infrastructure that we can version. We want, like, the thing that I was talking about the other week where I'm just like, oh fuck, it is approximately as easy to manage one VPC as it is to manage 50 VPCs. Like, everybody gets a fucking VPC. Same code, right? You add like 5 lines and of like to a different environment, and suddenly you can spin up a copy of production. And yeah, you can write software to do all of this for you, but you've effectively forked yourself off from the community. I think that the energy in our industry towards composability, towards having individual components that help you build infrastructure by interacting with each other instead of trying to own the whole thing. Like, the energy is focused around HashiCorp and Terraform right now. There are not many people out there who are trying to do something as ambitious and if you look at the bugs that we're encountering today, and you look at the bugs that we were seeing like a year ago or 2 years ago, Kevin can speak to this. I wasn't using it. I'm just looking through the Git reports and going, holy shit, those were some basic bugs. we're now on to much more like, all right, next time I add a relatively new resource type, I'm going to make sure I'm never doing this again until I have like a reliable, robust staging environment with a separate state file so that it doesn't blow up production. And if you follow me on Twitter, you know I'm a little bit of a drama queen who loves outages and just like screaming about technology, right? So it's like I wouldn't be using this thing if I didn't believe that it has the potential, it has the energy, it has the responsiveness, it has the vibrancy of the community and people like Kevin and Lucis who are, you know, amazing engineers who are putting a lot of energy into making it better. And it's just it's the train that I've decided to jump on. There are other trains heading towards the same goal, but I think that for my reasons, this is the best.
Sure. Part of the underpinning of my question isn't a critique. It's more we have sort of like a very iterative infrastructure approach where we've got an automation API. You go into chat ops, you're like, give me more instances of this type, or make a new thing of this type. And sort of it depends on operators to sort of continue building that. Although it ended up being very, very collaborative, which is something that I'm curious about here. Anyway, I'm mainly trying to figure out like how I got it wrong, and should I be rethinking how we're sort of doing things because of the energy in the industry as you described.
It sounds like you have a lot of path dependency that's gone into making what you have work really well. Do you have any pain points around not being able to roll back things that you've done to your infrastructure?
Not particularly.
Yeah, then there's no reason to like reinvent the wheel for something that's working well for you.
I feel the same way.
But at your next company, I would like start with a different set of assumptions.
Totally. I'm just here to learn right now.
The thing that I like, where we get that sort of collaboration, is that if we need another instance in the production environment, because there's different numbers of instances for different tiers in staging your ATM production, then that's something that we inject as effectively an attribute into the production environment. That's just a PR. We get a PR, we thumbs up it, it gets merged, and Terraform apply runs. It's sort of the same thing as that you've got with chat ops, right? Where you say add another instance or whatnot. It just gives us this sort of history that we can roll back from, and we have. So I mean, if you have that in another way, then man, that's great, right? This is just sort of the way that we just sort of adopted that model.
I really look forward to seeing the first team who tries to integrate Terraform and FOPS. It's going to be a fucking tire fire, and it's going to be amazing. It's going to be ultimately amazing. I can't wait. You should totally do it, Brian. Do it. I take back everything I said. You should absolutely do this.
I would say also that the thing is everything else out there is just as problematic as Terraform. It's just different. It's sort of like which cool ball of like Cutco knives that are glued together do you want to start juggling? Because they all have their ups and downs, and overall I think Terraform is evolving into a very nice set of declarative abstractions that's also been built from the ground up with two assumptions. One is to sort of be multi-provider, and the other is a commitment to that plan phase being like really usable. Like it's, you know, that dry run phase is far more useful and accurate, in my opinion, than anything else I run into.
Infrastructure as code is something that we've been saying that phrase for years now, but what we have meant by it is not very sophisticated until fairly recently, right? We've meant, oh, I'm automating this component, or oh, I'm like scripting this thing, or oh, I'm making something that depends on something else, or so that I'm not running things, you know, by hand or via like distributed bash commands or whatever. Infrastructure as code, like we're raising the bar on what that definition means, right? From infrastructure as code being for components to the whole thing, and that that's hard. That's hard, and we're early on in that. And I think it's worth investing into. But like, let's be reasonable. This is not a maturely this is not a mature space.
The way I talk about this is that it's the first 50 years of the internet, right? And that we're building the foundations of it. That's sort of why I work so hard on this, is that everything I ever did with Chef, I loved. It was much better than setting up machines by hand. But it felt like sort of putting it together with mud. And the analogy I used earlier of building with bricks is honestly what I sort of am feeling like now that I've adopted these tools. So I don't know, it's just an exciting time to be alive and to be working on these things. I'm making a bet on Terraform. It feels pretty good.
Yeah, 100%. Totally.
How much do you think that's going to be picked up by enterprise? Do you feel like it's really something that's just going to stay in the open source kind of world, or to smaller to mid-sized type of companies?
I can speak to that. We were a startup that got bought out by a Fortune 100 company. I gave a talk to our internal technology team that handles all of the business units, and it was very well received, and it was received as a paradigm shift. I don't know what will happen, but that's just my own experience. There's always that adoption curve, right? And I think that the biggest challenge is that, and even if you go back to systems in the enterprise that have been around from the early 90s, I work in banking, right? There's mainframe systems that still exist. Those are not going to get rewritten with Terraform. They're just not. But there's probably this slow adoption of new things being in the new paradigm, and then the important things that are possible to be sort of re-rolled into this paradigm. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I had a quick conversation with someone relating to, a lot of these new frameworks like Kubernetes and things like that, and how it seems to have a very small group of active users that are really based in the open source kind of market. And we talked about how it would impact enterprise markets as these technologies grow. And while we've seen like Chef and Puppet really do that, we're not really sure about like Kubernetes and things like that. And I'm curious if you think HashiCorp wants to take it to that point, or if it's just kind of yet another project.
I think that the money is in the enterprise for HashiCorp. I think that's sort of, when you look at their product, range, that's kind of a truism, and I think from what I know of folks over there and stuff, I think that is a bit where they see, And I think they do work hard to keep that in mind, via like supporting various VMware technologies, cloud stack, things like that. I think they have a good eye on some of the more traditional enterprise infrastructure support as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the trajectory of the few successful open source based companies, like OpsCode is one of them, Mongo was another. They started out getting early adopters to be passionate about it, but you have to work towards being useful to the people with the money, right? And I think this is the reason that HashiCorp is building products that I personally think are completely unnecessary, like fucking Nomad. I think it's part of a grand scheme to eventually build a complete ecosystem and extract dollars from people like Kevin. I mean, your employer, which I support. I mean, I want these projects to live long and prosper, and that means you have to find ways to make money.
Well, there's two other pieces of the current tech economy is that more and more, you're seeing the acquisitions are enterprise companies, right? IBM's bought up a number of companies, and that is in part also because those companies are also seeing the need to transform their relevance in some way and maintain that. But then also, I think, the enterprise and the web startup worlds are converging more and more. Look at the success of Pivotal and Cloud Foundry, right? That's their growth is fueled by that enterprise companies, even enterprise tech leadership is seeing some of the to use a buzzword, transformative things about some of the infrastructure and patterns that have become kind of like bread and butter to us. And so folks that are out there that have an eye on bridging that gap, like, I think like what Cloud Foundry does in a lot of ways, there is a lot of upside to that, and I think HashiCorp sees that as well.
I think like there's a real long-term health associated with a project like Kubernetes, simply because I think that Kelsey Hightower himself has been such a great advocate for it, and I feel like ultimately when these types of projects have people that are out there and constantly reminding there's alternatives to what you're already doing, here are how we've succeeded with them. It only can help to that point, and I think that's what I'm curious if Terraform and HashiCorp are kind of back it the way, say, Google backs them. Obviously, they have way more money, but I just feel like if you have that kind of advocate, you see these things kind of burst onto the scene, kind of the way I've seen Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think so. I think like, Clint and Paul, the two folks that work on Terraform, are also like, they're building a good community. And you see HashiCorp starting to do stuff like the HashiCorp user groups, right? The hugs and doing talks. And I think that they're taking a balanced approach given all the the pies they have their fingers in as well. I think there's no denying that a lot of HashiCorp tools have become indispensable for most of us in one way or another. So.
No. Packer, God. Packer is like the most Unix-like infrastructure component that it's just, God, it's so perfect. It does one thing and it does it well and it isn't complicated and it like made my life just better. I love it. I wish they would just like freeze it in time like Han Solo and Carbonite and just never change it.
Yeah. My only problem with using Packer and Terraform is like I'm constantly forgetting like which one of those two things does have support for one thing or the other, or like wait, is that like a step in the Packer workflow, or that like I forget sometimes like what is like which one does which things when I'm envisioning.
So as I build out a team who's using Packer and Terraform and Chef and like whatever shit we write ourselves, like I want to make it's a priority of mine. And we're not there yet, right? I'm so early. I've been working on this company for what, 3 months, but I think that having people not have to use their memory or their docs to remember where the source of truth for something lives is really, really important. Like having clear lines, like who owns DNS for like for what zones. Like obviously, I have Terraform like managing the root DNS zone, but all it does is manage the records that are at base hound.sh, and then it creates all of the zone files for all of the subdomains, and then like all of the records for internal and external are managed by configuration management. Just having like clear lines of demarcation so that you can remember where anything is stored and not have to like start grabbing and thinking about it really hard is what I think makes using lots of tools a tractable problem.
I completely agree. I mean, I have to talk about all this stuff, and that's the core of my argument, is that, yes, there's lots of tools involved, but each one does one thing well, and there's clear lines of demarcation between sort of where things should live. Furthermore, I'm late for the meeting. I'm going to have to go. But if any other questions, I told them I'd be a little late. If anyone has anything for me before I drop off. Nothing?
No, I think it's a good place to wrap it up. We can continue discussions on Twitter and the Hangops Slack, which if anyone's watching and they're not on, go to signup.hangops.com and fix that. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks for organizing. Oh, and Chef Hoodie.
That's right.
Oh, there we go. Chef Twins.
Awesome. Cheers.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks. Bye.